Hello, and welcome back to Zilog and Moto, where this week I'm looking at a game that might seem familiar if you're a long-time viewer of the channel. If this is your first time at Zilog and Moto, I'm glad you're here and are joining me on this long-running look at the English language libraries of the Sega Master System, Genesis/Mega Drive, Sega CD, and 32X. And note, I said English language there, as I'm covering games from all regions for these consoles. If I can read what's on the screen and follow along with the action, it's in play for the Zilog and Moto library. That caveat is especially important this week because this week's game is one of the well over 100 titles that were released for the Master System in Europe, but not in the United States. I really enjoy covering these titles because most of these games got zero coverage in the United States during their original lifespan, and they're almost completely unknown for me. For instance, last week's review of Tailspin for the Genesis. Tailspin was a game that I was well aware of and had seen for years and years in magazines, advertisements, Blockbuster. I just had simply never played it. But then there's games like Asterisk, Basketball Nightmare, and Back to the Future 2, where I had no idea they even existed, and playing each of them is like opening a whole new chapter in the book of that console. Now, granted, in the case of something like Back to the Future 2, it's a chapter that most people probably would have skipped, but as far as I'm concerned, I'm all in for this channel, and that means reviewing all these games, not just the well-known ones or the hidden gems. Okay, now that that's out of the way, let's get to this week's game, which is Cool Spot for the Master System. I mentioned that Cool Spot might look familiar, and that's because previously I reviewed the Genesis version back in episode 68. Cool Spot is just a fantastic game in the Genesis library that I think tends to get overlooked a bit due to it being about a soft drink mascot. Can you imagine that conversation in the schoolyard? Hey, I just got this cool new platformer for the Genesis. Oh, really? Which one is that? Sonic the Hedgehog? Aladdin? X-Men? No, you know that red dot from the 7-Up bottle? They made a game about it. I'm not going to finish that conversation, but as we all know, kids can be dumb and mean. For those of you that never played Cool Spot in any of its incarnations, I definitely recommend checking out the Genesis version or watching that episode of the channel, as it's truly one of my favorite games on the console and just does pretty much everything well. After the release of that Genesis version, the game was successful enough to also be ported to the Super Nintendo, Game Boy, Game Gear, Amiga, PC, and the subject of today's video, the Master System. The Master System version was released exclusively in PAL territories about 6 months after it debuted on the Genesis in October of 1993. You might think that would make it a pretty late release in the Master System's lifespan, coming out in late 1993, and you'd be right. Technically, the Master System still got a decent amount of titles in 1994, but for all intents and purposes, 1993 was the swan song for the console in Europe. So, how did a port of a great game on a more powerful console turn out when shrunk from 8 megabits down to 2? And seeing as how I'm doing this video in 2022, what the hell is a Cool Spot anyway? Well, I'll discuss all that and more, but first, a look at the package.
And this is my copy of Cool Spot. I think I grabbed this in a lot with a few other European Master System titles in the last year or two. Unfortunately, being in the US and trying to collect these PAL exclusives can be a bit of a pain at times, because many retro stores with an online presence refuse to ship to the United States for whatever reason. Some claim it's because they don't want to deal with complaints from people who bought a game and didn't realize that there might have problems playing it in their American console. But let's be honest, we're talking retro games here. It's not a bunch of stupid kids buying these games. It's adults that I'm sure are very aware of the differences between NTSC and PAL, amongst other things. I think they just don't want to deal with shipping to the US, and I at least respect that reason, even if it does make things more difficult on me. Anyway, instead, what I try to do every now and then is find a European seller on eBay that actually has some multiple listings and try to get them in chunks, because let me tell you, the shipping charges in some cases are more expensive than the damn game, depending on where it's coming from. Okay, collecting rant over, let's move on to the physical package, which at first looks to be in great shape with the hang tab being intact at the top of the case, and the outer cover looking intact with minimal scratching and no deep gouges. However, I said looking intact there. Unfortunately, looking isn't necessarily the same thing as being. As I flip over to the back of the case, you can see something odd with some cellophane packing tape on the edge. I'm not going to fully remove it to confirm, but it appears that somehow the entire rear outer cover got separated, and they used the tape to keep it held together. Don't ever change, eBay. All joking aside, I'll probably just eventually replace the case, and at least it's a decent enough do-it-yourself repair for now. Back on the front cover, and I like this art a lot. All over covers are definitely not the norm for the Master System titles, and Cool Spot getting one I think is a combination of it being a late release and a third-party title. The cover is a rendition of Cool Spot on the beach from the levels Shell Shock and Surf Patrol in-game, and I think it's a nice depiction, but maybe could have used some enemies from in-game to add some more color. Also, this is actually the exact same cover that was used for the Mega Drive edition in Europe, minus the yin-yang symbol on the surfboard for some odd reason. No idea what's up with that. Flipping over the back, and you can immediately tell this is a PAL release due to the 8 languages that are covered in fine print over to the right. As far as the English line goes, I never knew that British Surfer Dude existed, but they were apparently trying to make that a thing here by including words like chums, gopping, and savory complete with a U. The screenshots are actually a little oversaturated, but not terrible, and each one shows off one of the various level types. One thing that does stand out here, though, the level indicator shows 11, just like the Genesis version. I don't want to spoil too much, but yeah, that might not be accurate. Opening up the case, and you can tell this is a third-party release with the bright red label on the cartridge. Don't think I've seen that before. Then there's also the massive manual that barely fits into the case. The manual is so big due to having 15 pages per 7 languages, but those 15 pages are used well in describing the game, and to be honest, one of Cool Spot's strengths is that it's a relatively simple game to begin with, so they didn't need that much space to help the player out. Okay, that's the package for Cool Spot. Let's get to the game and see if the Master System version lives up to the legacy of its big brother. Ports of games to less powerful hardware can go many different ways. The Genesis is well known as being a landing spot of arcade games that almost always originally ran on significantly more powerful boards, and as I've seen on Zilog and Moto in the past, sometimes those ports are done well, with a game really getting across that same feel and excitement of the original arcade game. And some are definitely done on the cheap, producing a game that just feels like a cash grab that's riding on simply the name of the original arcade machine alone. The Master System didn't get nearly as many arcade ports as the Genesis, but what it did get a lot of was games that also appeared on the Genesis, in some form. I've covered a few of these previously, and they themselves get into different categories of releases, but there's always one constant, and that's that because the Genesis is so much more powerful than the Master System, the designers of the 8-bit version always have to make concessions about what they're going to include in their version of the game. Do they drop things equally across the board, with both the graphics and sound paling in comparison to the original? Do they focus on putting all the resources into graphics to make the games look as close as they can, while making the sound merely an afterthought? Or do they create a totally new game that really only shares a name and concept with the original, allowing them to not be boxed into a previously existing design? Each of those are valid and understandable choices to be made by the developers, with certain options making more sense depending on the title in question, and what the publisher was trying to focus on with the release. But with all three of those paths, usually the end result is a game that just doesn't quite measure up at best. Usually. But every now and then you run across a port that's done so well that maybe it doesn't look quite as good, maybe it doesn't quite sound as good, and maybe it's missing some features or levels that the original had, so the developers could crowbar the game into a much smaller cartridge, but the end result is a game that feels every bit as good to play as the original. For Cool Spot, I didn't know what to expect when I popped it in this week. If you watch my review of the Genesis version, you know that I think it's a special title, and a game that has held up amazingly well, with still looking and sounding impressive for a 16-bit title, and being every bit as much fun 30 years later. As a result, the Master System version has a very, very high bar to match, due to all of the things that the Genesis version didn't just do well, but did correctly. Well, I can honestly say that right off the bat, I was blown away. In short, this is Cool Spot, regardless of it running on an 8-bit console instead of the Genesis. The game starts out in the same way as the Genesis version, with Cool Spot surfing the waves on top of a conspicuously unmarked 7-Up bottle, while the player is able to go into the options screen or start a game. After that, the game goes to the same loading screen from the original that has a simple explanation of what the player should be doing as they go through the game, and then it's off to the first level Shell Shock, as Cool Spot explores the beach and attempts to rescue its fellow Spot friends from the uncool enemies in the level. My first time playing the game was when I was hanging out with someone, so I wasn't in full analysis mode and instead was just messing around a bit before we moved on to doing something else. But even when playing the game when not giving it my full focus, it was apparent that the developers had put the original game under a microscope and produced something that fully respected the original source material, and tried to get as close to that original Genesis version as possible. I mentioned earlier when discussing the manual that one of Cool Spot's strengths is its simplicity. This works in the game's benefit when being ported to the Master System, as Cool Spot really only needs the use of 2 buttons, a jump button and a shot button. In fact, I suppose if you really wanted to stretch the definition of the genre, you could call Cool Spot a run and gun instead of a platformer. However, the truth is probably more somewhere in the middle, maybe a platformer with run and gun mechanics. Cool Spot's goal in each level is to try to collect a certain percentage of cool points out of 100, while avoiding enemies and level hazards, and then once a high enough percentage is collected, Cool Spot is able to bust their Spot friend out of a cage at the end of the level, and then move on to the next level to rescue their next friend in the same fashion. Having been familiar with the 16-bit Cool Spot already in that simplicity, I was able to pick up a controller and immediately start making my way through Shell Shock. And upon doing that, I noticed something that I wasn't expecting, and that's that the level layout for Shell Shock was exactly the same as the Genesis version, or at least close enough to where you'd have to really put them side by side to spot the differences. This is huge for this version, as one of the original strengths was the level layouts, which were very well designed, and while some are certainly more linear than others, they all provide the player with many options as how to proceed through. For instance, in that first level, do you go beachcombing first, and then duke it out with the crabs? Or do you take to the air and swing across the top of the level amongst the floating balloons? All of that same level structure is fully intact, and is the main reason why when I say this version is Cool Spot. Another of the original designs was the concept of bonus levels being available after the completion of the regular levels. These are levels that you don't have to play, but if you do, each allows you to earn a continue and to aid you in making it through the game. I'd kind of assumed that these levels might have been cut from the game in this version just because something had to be cut, but no, they're still here, and again using the same design from the original game. It just reinforces how much care the developers have put into the Master System version in an attempt to bring the same Cool Spot experience to the players. There are some differences between the versions as far as content is concerned, as you might expect. The first change is that unfortunately the game only has 8 of the original 11 levels. Cut from the original game are the 2 levels that seem to take place in a toy store, toying around and wound up, and then 1 level that features Cool Spot on a moving model train named Locomotive. I wonder if the original plan was to include those 3 levels in the port as well, seeing as how the back of the box shows 11 levels, and then they were cut at the last minute with the rear cover just not being updated to match. Obviously, I would have preferred for all the levels to be included, but with the quality of what is here, I totally understand the removal. This game might have come out in late 1993, and at that point, the developers would have known every trick in the book when it comes to Master System development, but at the same time, the developers aren't magicians either, and at some point, there are just limits to what they can do. Aside from those 3 missing levels, all references to 7-Up have been removed. This one is a bit of a head-scratcher. It would be similar to if the Chester Cheetah games didn't reference Cheetos. How do you make a video game based on a product mascot and not reference the product the mascot is associated with? Well, this was apparently due to Cool Spot not being the mascot for 7-Up in Europe, as instead it was a cartoon character named Fido Dido. I understand the change, especially if there were international rights involved, but it definitely feels a bit weird, especially due to the way the bonus levels work, where now you are spelling out virgin when collecting continues, instead of Uncola. I won't try to say that Cool Spot looks or sounds just as good as the original, as that would be silly. The Genesis version combined colorful graphics with detailed backgrounds and foregrounds, and fluid animation for not just Cool Spot, but also the uncool enemies and the various attacks. For the Master System version, the animations have been simplified a bit, and the backgrounds have definitely been toned down, but the game still looks fantastic. I would go so far as to say, as this does not look like an 8-bit title, and instead it's more in the category of something like Asterix, where there are definitely games released for the Genesis that don't look this good. There wasn't an NES version of Cool Spot attempted, but if there had been, I can guarantee it wouldn't look anywhere near as good as this, as it simply wouldn't have been possible on that console. I don't think I can state just how impressed I am with the graphics in this effort, as it's probably the best looking game I've played thus far on the Master System. With as fantastic as the graphics are, you might be assuming that the audio suffered in transition, with the efforts being focused just on the visuals. This is especially a concern because while the Genesis version is notable for smooth animation, it also features great sound from Tommy Tallarico. As much as he's recently left a bad taste in some people's mouths with the Amico disaster, remember, at one point he was a fantastic musician and sound engineer. To deal with this, Virgin Interactive smartly brought in Chrysalis Software and marvelous Matt Furness to provide audio, and if that name sounds familiar, he was previously responsible for the only thing worth a damn in Back to the Future 3, the sound. Matt did a great job with the soundtrack and the effects. Sure, the music isn't as good, and some of the digital effects didn't make the conversion, but the game still sounds great, and it does sound like the original. Especially in tracks like the background music for the bonus level, that still gets across the beat-the-clock intensity that you would expect. Cool Spot on the Master System is a unicorn. It's a port of an already fantastic game that somehow manages to take that original, cram it into a space that's a quarter of the size, while only removing a minimal amount, and still results in a game that's nearly as good as the original, and stands among the best efforts on the console as a whole. As a result, I'm giving Cool Spot for the Master System 4 stars. If you're a Master System fan, you need this in your collection, and you really have no excuse, as complete copies of the game are dirt cheap right now, going for about $15 before shipping.
Okay, that was Cool Spot for the Master System, in one of the nicest surprises I've had the entire time of doing Zilog and Moto. I was expecting a cheap copy of the original, poor animation, mediocre sound, possibly even big changes to the level design, but thankfully none of that is present here, and instead it's a faithful and, most importantly, fun representation of Cool Spot. I can't recommend it enough. There are far worse ways to spend an hour and a half in your day. Tune in next week, and it's light gun time again for the Sega CD. This is another entry from American Laser Games, and after looking at Crime Patrol back in episode 69, I'm very curious if this game has some of the same issues that plagued Crime Patrol, or perhaps it'll fare a little bit better. I'm going to think positive here, as there were some things I liked about Crime Patrol, so hopefully things will go a bit smoother this time around. Well, that's it for Zilog and Moto, episode 168. If you liked what you saw here and want to see more, please think about liking and subscribing if you're so inclined, as it will help more people see these videos. But most importantly, whatever you like to play, have fun and be excellent to each other. Later.